Welcome to Leadership Log, a podcast on issues of relevance to the AFLCMC community. And with this being Mentorship Month, May, we wanted to sit down with Colonel Brady Hauboldt. He's the Vice Commander of the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center, and discuss mentorship and how that continues in the life of COVID-19. Sir, typically mentorship is often executed by use of shadow days or various courses that we operate. All of those things are gone now, right? So how does mentorship continue? Because obviously it needs to continue.
Yeah, Daryl, so COVID-19 has thrown a lot of us who believe in mentorship. We've lost a step a little bit, but I don't think that has stopped our desire and drive for mentoring. When I started in the Air Force, I was told you need to find a mentor, and I didn't really know what that meant until I found some. And really, all it is having a sounding board, somebody to run your ideas off of, get inputs and advice from, and we do that in a variety of ways. I know all of us here on the AFLCMC leadership team believe very strongly in mentorship. We've had a very strong shadow program for years. This has put a damper on actually having shadows with us. So it's been some time since I've had one here, but it doesn't preclude us from doing virtual mentoring. And I've continued to do that using many of the tools that we have now that we're using for telework, now for mentoring. Sometimes as simple as a phone call or a text message to check in on people and get some feedback. Recently, the Air Force Personnel Center announced that Air Force officers can transition to the U.S. Space Force, and I've had a couple people ask me about that, for example. I don't have all the answers, and that's the key thing about mentoring, is not to give people answers. Give them your perspectives, let them be to sound against you, and give them their individual desires and interests. I had a great mentor once tell me that you should get lots of data points when you seek out mentors, because none of them will be right. But when you combine all those data points with your own personal and your family interests, you can probably find the right curve, the right trajectory that fits for you. And that's what's important about mentoring, is to help shape your trajectory and what you want to do. As I said, I had some great mentors in my career, some by happenstance, some I sought out, some just took me under their wing, and all of us as leaders have a responsibility to do the same thing for those that want it, to teach, to coach, to help others find the right trajectory in their career. So we've had a hard time doing shadow days. We've not stopped many of our other activities. So ATAC has been somewhat paused, the Advanced Tactical Acquisition Corps. Our acquisition instructor course, AQUIC, has continued, but we've dispersed the students, this whole cohort, to go work on the acquisition task force supporting the COVID-19 response. Our SALT, our Senior Acquisition Leadership Team, has continued. Just took a briefing via CVR Teams on Friday from them as they're trying to figure out how to wrap up their coursework here this spring. Some of them still have outstanding courses to take that they're going to do when we start reopening. Those courses are taught by places like Georgetown and Stanford, so we can't control that. But we're trying to continue what we started with mentoring and professional development. Defense Acquisition University is open. Our Air University Pre-Command training is going on starting next week. People are continuing the mission despite the restrictions that COVID has placed on us, and that includes mentoring too.
Could you look back in your career and maybe identify a single person or an instance where someone gave you kind of an aha moment, where maybe things began to click and you gained a greater appreciation of the Air Force?
That's a difficult question, Daryl. So the first mentor I sought out was a colonel that shall remain nameless. He told me that I would probably not get promoted to major. I needed to think about what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I thought, that's not quite what I had thought, the trajectory that I was on. I sought out another mentor, and he gave me some more uplifting feedback, shall we say. But he put me on a path where I started thinking differently about controlling my own career and my own development. I wasn't constrained by the job I had or the office I was in. And so I knew I needed to do something different. I had spent the first half of my career, first 10 or so years in space, engineering, operations, acquisition, and I needed to do something differently, and I sought out that opportunity at the advice of a mentor, and I went to U.S. Special Operations Command next, and that opened my eyes, in part because I got to see some very different leadership styles, but I also found that you can really make a lot of progress if you just grab the steering wheel and go. With programs, in that case, with my own professional development and the charter for my career, the course of my career. I won't name names. I had some great mentors. I had some terrible bosses too. We all had them, but they all make us stronger. And I think back to a lot of those leadership lessons that I've learned over the years. In fact, one of my mentors said very clearly, there is no copyright on good leadership. And so where you see it, you should embrace it, use those tools, adapt them for yourself, and be the leader that you can be. I also would say that one of the best advices I ever received was to be yourself, be authentic, because if you try to be like some other boss that you respected, it'll come across as disingenuous and people won't trust you. So be yourself, and even when you're thrust into very different kinds of jobs or challenges that you think if you think you're not ready for, just be yourself and you'll be fine.
I've heard other people talk about the core values and say that the core values are like a guidepost that people can use in those instances where the AFIs don't give you an answer. Talk to us a little bit about the core values and kind of just the basic way of making a decision during tough times like that.
Well, when you talk about tough decisions, I think most of us have been taught service and excellence in all we do. We've been trained that way. We've been taught that way. Integrity is where the tough questions face us. And I don't mean ethical decisions necessarily, but when you find yourself in a conflict of values, the decision making is incredibly hard. And the values may not be right and wrong. It might be right and also right, but they conflict, and those are the really tough decisions. For example, as a squadron commander, having to make very difficult decisions about my airmen's lives, their families, their careers, whether they should continue in the Air Force. Those are tough decisions because as commanders, we're paid to uphold the Air Force's interest, but at the same time, I can't forget about the individual and his family and all that a decision that I make might have on those people. So it's a conflict of value, but not necessarily a conflict of integrity. I would also say some of the challenges I've had in my career were in organizations which lacked overall integrity. Individual people had integrity, but as an organization, we had allowed our standards to reduce to a point where, as an organization, we weren't doing the right thing any longer. And those are very difficult decisions to make, and changing the culture of an organization is incredibly difficult, but important, again, for the Air Force and in our mission.
So for a leader, you come into an organization and maybe you need to invoke some sort of culture change like that. That can be a very difficult position to be in, especially if an organization has if people are comfortable with the level of service that they've been providing, but now this needs to change to better serve the Air Force. Talk about working through that and kind of being that, in some instances, the lonely leader who has to make a change that people don't necessarily want.
Sometimes you have to make those tough decisions as the leader, and you have to seek out your mentors. You have to seek out counsel, sometimes legal counsel. But to find your path to the right answer, everybody on the team relies on you as the boss, as the leader, to make those tough decisions. And if you fail to make the tough decisions, you'll probably lose the respect of those that were in the right, if you will. And so sometimes we just have to make the tough decisions and leave the organization a better place than when we came in. It might involve terminating the employment of some people. And again, to those tough decisions that we have to make that affect people's lives, sometimes it's the right thing to do for the Air Force. And that's what's ultimately important, and why they put us in charge of organizations, is to make those tough decisions. I found that in some cases it was mentally fatiguing for myself. Sometimes you feel alone, but if you have advisors, mentors, counsels, it'll save your day, your life potentially. So you have to seek out those trusted advisors. I've had an ops officer who I trusted, a senior NCO that I've trusted, multiple. Find them, seek them out, and let them help you make the decisions that are so hard to make as the boss.
So you're talking to a young lieutenant program manager coming in, taking a lead of a program that maybe has other individuals on the team that are older than that person is. Maybe they have more years. Maybe they're contractors or civilians. And now this lieutenant needs to come in and take lead of this group. That's not an easy thing to do sometimes. Mm-hmm. So how do you talk somebody through a situation like that?
Oh, I believe leadership knows no rank, for one. So the junior second lieutenant or GS-12 can be the leader. It takes a different style, obviously, when you're not wearing the rank or have the tenure and the respect of the team, but anybody can be a leader. And I believe that you should. If there's a vacuum, if there's a need, you should step up and lead. And it might just be offering critical thinking or ideas. That might be the way you lead, is to help give your boss the tools that they need to be successful. That's called servant leadership. I'm a believer in it, and anybody who watches this or anybody who's new to the Air Force Lifecycle Management Center should think about how they can help lead their organization, no matter what position or rank you are.
So talking about servant leadership and trying to empower people and to develop them professionally and personally, do you think that that's something that's just naturally a good fit in the acquisition community, where oftentimes we put young people in positions of great responsibility?
I think it's harder as a junior member of our acquisition workforce to actually apply leadership. So my story was, I was on a very large space program as a young captain. How do you affect change on a $10 billion program when you're at the bottom, essentially looking up, and you're surrounded by GS-15s and colonels? That's a tough thing to do, but you have to find a way, and eventually I find that people will listen to you if you have good ideas. Well thought out, rational, and critical thinking ideas that you can contribute to help the mission. To me, that's leadership in an acquisition environment, but it is very difficult on some of our programs. The other end of the spectrum, there are a lot of very small programs that our junior workforce are leading. No questions that they're leading, and they're doing great things with them. Innovative, fast, agile, and I think that you can lead. You have to seek out those opportunities. Coming out of space business and acquisition, after about 10 years, I went to U.S. Special Operations Command and had the opportunity to lead dozens of programs suddenly. And it taught me that you can do it. You can lead no matter what level you're at. You just have to find the right niche. I also would tell a story about a master sergeant who once told me, if you're not stepping on some toes, you're not trying hard enough. And about 6 weeks later, he came back to me and said, "You're stepping on my toes, LT." So I think you have to push hard and drive that change, and it doesn't matter what your rank is or grade. You'll find bosses that give you a lot of leash to go do that. Relish those opportunities, because there's bosses that won't give you that opportunity as well. But when you do, take it and run with it. That's the best advice I could give to a member of our junior acquisition workforce.
So from your position now, you have young individuals, you're trying to empower them, give them an opportunity to come to you with great new innovative ideas, but sometimes people have bad ideas. And so how do you talk to a person? How do you give them feedback when they've got an idea that needs work? without squashing their innovative spirit?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I believe, and especially when I was a program executive officer, a lot of what we do is teach and coach. I can't sit in on every IPT discussion about how to come up with a strategy, for example. I might not see it until it's been saucered and blown and it's ready for approval, but I have to make sure, I have an obligation to make sure that they've thought through, the logic is sound, and at the end of the day, if that program manager or whatever career field is leading that IPT, if that IPT lead is going to execute the solution and they believe in it, that's probably the right decision. I might have come up with a different approach, but that's okay. I'm not executing that activity anymore. Ultimately, I want the person who is executing it to be empowered to come up with the right answer. My job is just to make sure or help ensure that they get there, get to the right answer.
So a lot of bosses will tell you that they don't want to make your decisions for you, okay? So how do you counsel someone early in their career to know this is a question I need to take to the boss and get his approval on, or this is the decision I need to make on my own?
So one mentor told me, you promised to share information and I promised not to overreact. So I learned fairly early on, certainly by the time I was a squadron commander, that your boss might be your best sounding board that you have. Tell your boss what you're going to do or trying to do, and they have an opportunity to give you feedback. Now, the challenge as the boss is to not give them the answer. Our brains are inherently lazy, and if we condition our teams to come to you for a decision on everything, guess what? They're going to come to you for a decision on everything. So one of my favorite stories is a team came to me with an acquisition strategy. I listened to the entire briefing, gave them some feedback, and then said, okay, what are you going to do? And they looked at me funny, like, well, we're here for the decision. I said, this is not my decision. This is your decision. And suddenly they owned it. And they went and changed a few things once they realized they owned it. But they also realized where the boundary was for me, my decision space. They hadn't crossed, and so I gave them the flexibility to do that. And that's really hard to do for bosses and leaders is to not just say we're empowering you, but to actually drive you to make those decisions.
Lastly, does mentorship ever stop?
It doesn't. I am mentored probably 5 days a week, sometimes more. Sometimes it's on the golf course. I've got a call on Friday with a former boss on getting some mentoring. So it never stops at any level. It is sometimes lonelier at the top of an organization, and it's harder to find your mentors. Sometimes they're not in uniform anymore, not in federal service, but that's okay. Most of the time, once you start mentoring somebody, they'll continue to support you throughout your career and life. I do find that it changes a little bit. Your questions you ask and the advice you're seeking or giving changes a little bit over time, but that's okay. That happens.
Sir, talk to us about leadership philosophy, and what are your thoughts of the attributes of a leader, of how a leader should conduct themselves?
Well, obviously, core values is an easy one to fall back to, but I think we all develop our own leadership style and approach throughout our career and the experiences we have, the good leaders, the good bosses, the bad bosses that we see over time. I do believe that there's no copyright on good leadership. You should write down or copy, duplicate what you see that works well, but ultimately be authentic, make it your own. Don't try to conform to what you think a good boss looks like. It didn't really dawn on me until I took command as a lieutenant colonel at Vandenberg Air Force Base, so the 4th Space Launch Squadron. I took command one day. The next day I walked into the office early the next morning. I was all by myself, and I had this giant whiteboard, and it was like it was waiting for me to define what my command was going to be. And I was a little bit overwhelmed, but I decided to write down one thing on the board to kind of help frame where I was going to take the organization, the squadron, in the first 90 days. I wrote down people, passion, and purpose. And I erased that on the last day of 3 years in command. I had never meant to leave it up there so long, but it stuck with me, and it really shaped not only how I acted as a leader in that assignment, but in all my subsequent assignments. So people, connect with people. Ultimately, the humans are what make our organizations go. They're what make you an effective leader or a bad leader. It's the humans. And so you have to connect with people and understand a little bit about who they are and what motivates them, what's going on in their life that's good and bad, and how to influence them toward the common goal. Passion, I find a smile is contagious, but so is a lot of enthusiasm. So if you come to work and energized every day and smile, it's going to spread throughout your organization, and they're going to pitch in too. Even if you don't feel like you have a lot of energy that day, you have to find a way. Sometimes I have to close the door and recharge my batteries a little bit, but have passion for what you do, and your team will embrace it. And finally, purpose. Do you know what you're doing and why? For example, public affairs is not just to publish articles. You're there to tell our workforce's message. You're there to explain and link what our most junior people are doing to support the defense of our nation, to advertise their successes. And if you can communicate the purpose for what you're doing and why, one, it energizes people to support it, but most importantly, when you're not around, they're aligned with the real purpose, the mission of your organization or the task at hand. And so I never meant, like I said, for it to stick with me, but I wrote people, passion, purpose on my whiteboard that first day of command, and it stuck with me ever since.
We talk about leadership a lot. Followership is another element of that. And so can you talk about the importance of being a follower and supporting the team?
Sometimes it's hard. I've come to find that I like being the boss, but I don't always get to be the boss, as I'm right now. I'm the vice boss. But the main thing is communicating and talking to whoever your boss is. And by the way, we all have bosses, right? Doesn't matter if you're the president of the United States, you have a boss. Understanding what your boss needs from you, and being able to define the purpose, like I said, being able to communicate that to everybody else and carry out the mission of your organization aligned with the priorities and objectives of your boss. And so as I came into this job, I had the fortune of already having worked with Lieutenant General McMurray and Ms. Wadden for some time, and that was a fairly easy transition. It's not always that easy. Sometimes it takes a while to get to know your boss, and that's important, but you have to fight for, they say fight for feedback, but fight for input from your bosses on what they're looking for. So if they give you the grumpy cat face all the time, you're probably not communicating well and understanding what they're looking for. And it's okay to ask them because they don't always think to tell you.
So, sir, in closing, what would you say to a young lieutenant or captain or GS-12 who is just kind of on the fence about whether or not they really need to have a mentor? Would you tell them to seek somebody out? Multiple people? What would be your counsel to them?
We all need sounding boards. So yes, and yes, multiple people. To me, there are good mentors out there. There are bad mentors out there too. So find the people that are a good fit for you, and not just your spouse or your significant other. They don't want to hear about your workday all the time. Trust me. Jennifer hears enough. But find the people that you can rely on. And you never know when you might need them for some special bit of advice or some experience that they had that you can apply to what you're doing. So you don't know who's going to get the mentor tag necessarily. In fact, with MyVector, one of the new Air Force tools, you can just hang a shingle out and say, I'm looking for a mentor, and somebody gets assigned to you. Or you can reach out and grab one on the list. I'm on the list as a development team member. I support our 6.2 engineers and our 6.3 program managers, but I try to do the same for the military side as the civilian side, and I have plenty of civilian folks, employees come and talk about their career. And for me, I'll talk about whatever you want to talk about. What kind of car to buy? If you want to talk about that, that's mentoring to me. Typically, it's more on leadership or career development. But yes, reach out, find some. Some won't work. Some will work beautifully, and you should keep them in your on your contact list.
Sir, thank you very much for sitting down with us during this month of mentorship and sharing your thoughts.
My pleasure. Thank you.